This is part 2 of the lesson that we began in the part 1 video. We're going to finish up the lesson, A Day That Lived in Infamy, Pearl Harbor. So we're working on the back, the second page of your instructions if you printed those out. Those instructions were found at the link here, the practice lesson, and they look like this. So we're looking at page 2, the Analyze section. Now I'm asking students, what was the Japanese strategy? Before we just speculated about what it could be, and now we're going to look at what the actual strategy was. So we're going to turn on this layer, Japanese attack on Oahu, first wave, and that appears. That's so cool. So now we can see from which direction did the Japanese attack, and students would describe the attack from the north, that the planes circled the island and then came in from the west to actually attack from the south. And my American history teacher that I collaborate with, she always, talks to students about what the Americans anticipated and how this particular approach from the north was not what the Americans anticipated. So then we look at the Japanese attack on Oahu, the second wave, and this appears. And now we're asking students to think about what did the Japanese attack in both the first and second waves, and then how was the second wave different. So what's really cool is that students can click on these paths of attack, like this this particular line, and they can see, okay, this was 43 fighter planes, this was 51 dive bombers, this was 40 torpedo bombers. My partner in U.S. history, she also shows students the Pearl Harbor film, and they look at these different elements of the attack, and I thought that was a really cool way to enhance their understanding, like visualize what those different planes look like. I also noticed that on the new version of the film Midway, and I thought that was a really good, that's something that I'll probably include, a little clip from that film so students can see what these different dive bombers versus torpedo bombers look like in the air. And then they can look at the second wave. They've got those high-level bombers, dive bombers, and fighter planes. And so they'll, from their observation in their notes, they'll talk about that there was more of a focus on the airfields and hangars without torpedo attacks in the second wave. And then we're moving on to the last part. Were the Japanese able to effectively eliminate the threat of American involvement in the Pacific theater of World War II? And I'm going to zoom back out. So we're going to ask students, what was the goal of the Pearl Harbor attack? And we would talk about as a class that they wanted to disable U.S. aircraft carriers and fighter planes. Then we're going to go to the bookmark here and select Pacific Theater. And we're going to turn on the layer Japanese Defense Perimeter here. And if we zoom back just a little bit, we can see that outline more clearly. Here we go. And then we're going to turn on the post-Pearl Harbor attack layer and play the time slider. So let's go post-Pearl Harbor attack, and the time slider is right here, and so we're going to see how we see these attacks happening around the perimeter, and I would talk about this with students. We'd look at this together, and then we see them moving closer and closer toward Japan. And then we see that that was one of the atomic bombs. So we would watch that a couple of times, might have students work in pairs or with small groups to talk about what they observe, and maybe even pause the time slider to look at some of those individual attacks. Those would be good observations to note. And my partner in U.S. history also talks about the island hopping strategy, so that's really good academic vocabulary to work in there and for students to use later in their writing. And then we're going to say what appeared to be the U.S. strategy in fighting the Japanese. So students should be observing and talking about that they see the U.S. progressively moving from east to west and taking back Japanese occupied territory, maybe using that term island hopping, something like that. Finally, we're going to ask them, were the Japanese able to prevent U.S. military involvement in the Pacific theater by their attack on Pearl Harbor? And the answer is a clear no. And that's something that I'll follow up with students in the writing assignment that we complete. There's another element of this map that is not included in this lesson, but it's included in the map, and I thought it was pretty cool. And I show this to students as well. The Japanese fleet here, and if we click on that, we can see some really good notes, and students can click through and read those map notes, and that really helps them understand more about the Japanese strategy. They're traveling in secret, the different parts of the fleet that they're moving in, traveling under radio silence so they don't give away their mission. They talk about the weather and things like that, so I thought that was pretty cool. And then the Pearl Harbor strike zone that's over here also has some notes and tells us that where the fleet gathered, and that's more information that they could use in this last writing activity. So once students have finished all of those activities with the map, then for assessment and to integrate some writing skills in the content area, I ask them to complete a writing task. And I do this on Canvas, have them submit it in a text box, and I have a little rubric with check marks, with that show, what the performance expectations are. So after they complete the map activity and they follow along, with me in class, then they complete this assignment. They have to write a well-developed paragraph and respond to these items, and they have to support their response with multiple points of explicit evidence from the ArcGIS map activity. First, they have to explain Japan's strategy to disable the forces on Oahu, and they have to support their response with multiple points of explicit evidence. Then they have to answer this question: were the Japanese able to effectively eliminate the threat of American involvement in the Pacific theater of World War II? And support their response with at least one point of evidence. So I put those prompts together just based on the questions that were provided in the lesson guide. And I do that for nearly all of the lessons I use on ArcGIS. And then I help the teacher score, give feedback to students, and we also talk about ways to introduce explicit evidence. So here's a sample response, and it shows students how to include explicit evidence. I wouldn't show them this sample. I would show them a sample based on other content. But for you, if you want to see what this looks like, what it sounds like, make sure students talk about specifics like the names of the types of armaments, the names of the islands, specific directions, north, south, east, west. Ask them to talk about specific points of attack, maybe in that island hopping strategy that was at the end of the lesson. So they have to, really give explicit details. They can talk about the specific distances of Japan to Oahu and then Oahu to Los Angeles. And a lot of students did really well with this activity this year because they just kind of started chronologically from our lesson start to finish, and just included observations that they noted along the way. And so this was a pretty good lesson. I hope that you have success and maybe some confidence to include some of these ArcGIS lessons with your work in the library and collaborate with a teacher. All right, guys, we'll move on to the second activity in this workshop, and I hope to see you there. Take care.